Well, 7, but I can't see us keeping to time particularly well, but...
So do you actually work for this organisation?
Part-time, yes. Mostly sort of ad hoc. But Josh, who's around here somewhere, does probably the most. It's really the brainchild of Yahya Asiri, who is not in the room.
How many of those involved actually?
In terms of the board, and Yahya, 4 or 5, in terms of like the main people that he's in touch with, people sort of supporting, actually, yeah, Ali is Saudi Arabia, Nasir is Saudi Arabia. So 2 of the 4. So myself and Josh really are the main non-Saudi supporters, assistants, as it were. Small group. In progress is a draft report on the situation in Saudi Arabia. And then after me, we'll have a number of speakers joining both by Skype or remotely, and then some other people who are in the room, some of whom come from far away. Iraq and Geneva and somewhere else in London.
Finsbury Park.
Yeah, that's easily the most exotic. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to cover quite a lot of ground and hopefully in the discussion perhaps come upon some of the issues that we want to sort of push forward on about, what can we actually really do? What are the kind of next steps that some of the groups that will be taking part today that we've been working on. In respect to the report that's on your desk, on your chair, I just want to mention, just really quickly, there's 2 broad areas of concern that ALQST has in respect to human rights in Saudi Arabia. They're the domestic situation and that takes place abroad, outside the country. Of course, many people know about Saudi Arabia's involvement in Yemen, but there are other factors in as well. In respect to the internal situation, most of what I want to just sort of address very quickly is the administration of justice. And I think that'll be things that Julia and Khalid and other speakers will address in more detail. So I'm not going to go into them in any particular detail. But in respect to administration of justice, I'm just going to mention 7 very quick issues of concern. First, use of the death penalty. This is including the use of ta'ziri or discretionary laws to apply the death penalty for crimes that are not considered the most serious under international law, the execution of child offenders and so on. Arbitrary arrests is the second. These are arrests undertaken where there's no legal basis under international criminal law for the arrest taking place. So this is protected conduct, those who are exercising the right to freedom of expression and so on. And the laws themselves, now we won't get into the laws, the report does address some of the laws that are used to undertake those arrests. Prolonged pre-trial detention is another issue. Again, that's kind of connected to an arbitrary arrest, and particularly we see this in respect to human rights defenders that I think Khalid will address. Unfair trials is the fourth. This is issues relating to a judiciary not being independent. And one issue of particular concern, again it's in the report, is the use of the SCC, the Specialized Criminal Court in Saudi Arabia. It was a court originally constructed to address terrorist national security crimes, but instead it's actually being used to stifle dissent. There are issues relating to excessive use of force, destruction of wholesale destruction of areas by the police and the security forces. And there was an incident in Awamiya in the Eastern Province. One thing I will like just to very quickly address, and again it's in the reports, is how waves of arrests have been used to destabilize and stifle the situation. And there have been three main waves kind of interspersed with other other events of individual arrests. And the first was in September of 2017, clerics and academics and so on. In November in 2017, probably the best known, this sort of corruption set of arrests when businessmen and so on were held in the Ritz-Carlton hotel in Riyadh? In Riyadh, thank you. And the last in May 2018, really focusing on one of a particular concern. I think Hala Adosari and perhaps others as well will address it, and that's arrest of human rights defenders, mainly women. I'm pretty sure that Khalid will address some of that too. Torture, use of torture is a particular concern to ALQST. Again, it's set out in the report. Prolonged detention of women, solitary confinement, denial of access to the outside world, and then again, I think Hala will address it when she joins us by Skype, but particular acts of torture inflicted against women, human rights defenders, and indeed others. To date, the authorities have not held anyone responsible for any of those incidents or alleged incidents. Harassment of the third point, the third of 4 points that I want to address here in respect to in kind of administration of justice, is the state media campaigns launched against human rights defenders, terming, for example, the women arrested in May 2018, defined as sort of terrorists, those who are against the country, and then the use, of course, of sort of the electronic army and trolls harassing defenders. The last point, not really administration of justice, very, very quickly, and I think, again, it's something that we'll discuss in group. Saudi Arabia is still a state party to some international human rights conventions. They are legally obliged to submit reports, and indeed in 2018 there were reports from the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which provide a lot of material for us to work with. And so maybe that's something we can return to in the discussion. Turning very quickly to issues outside the country, I think something that Anne in particular will address is the situation in Yemen. What sort of bombing has taken place of who, and I don't know exactly what Anne is going to address on that point, but how the killing of non-combatants and the lack of recompense, again covered to some degree by Human Rights Watch, has taken place, and of course mass starvation. Three other really quick points. There is an ongoing dispute between Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates against Qatar, and the upshot of which has been the splitting and the dividing of the families, and that's had a particular effect on a number of families in the region. There were Saudi Arabian nationals themselves outside the country when they had a spat with Canada. Now, Canada, the Foreign Minister of Canada sent a tweet expressing concern about the situation of human rights in the country, and Saudi Arabia decided to withdraw or would reduce relations with Canada, including by recalling all the students they had that were in Canada, and indeed those who were undergoing medical treatment in the country. So that's something that affects Saudi Arabia, but also those who are in Canada itself. Last, in respect to this, and it has to be said, I'm sure we'll be coming back to it, is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October in the Saudi Arabian consulates in October. Look, I'm sure we're going to come back to that in great detail, so I don't really want to linger on that now. We have got calls. It's something that I think we will end with, and I hope you'll stay with us till the end to explore what are the, what can we do? What can we appeal to the Saudi Arabia to do? And I guess chief of which is stop silencing people, stop quashing dissent with laws, with arbitrary arrests, with an unfair judicial process. Let human rights defenders do what they do best. Stop the use of the death penalty. And there are others too. But with that, hopefully with Sahar's or somebody else's assistance, we will go to our first guest joining us from Skype, Hala Adosari. She is in the United States.
Thank you, Jory, Diwan London, for having me. This is such an important session, especially as news of torture is coming from Saudi Arabia, in very disturbing details. I just wanted to highlight one thing, that most of those detained have actually been embracing a very crucial role in the transformation of Saudi Arabia. As you know, the Vision 2030 and the vision presented by Mohammed bin Salman when he first started to basically promote the changes in Saudi Arabia was very much rooted in transforming Saudi Arabia away from excessive or extreme Islamic interpretation and towards inclusion of women, towards economic reforms, and all those people who were arrested were such actually a vital force who have been for years advocating through social media and through the very limited spaces provided for citizens in Saudi Arabia. They were, like the patrons of those ideas. Abdullah al-Maliki, Mustafa al-Hassan, Salman al-Ouda himself, one of the clerics, and the women activists were actually on the forefront of those calls long before Mohammed bin Salman and the vision was launched. And they have actually transformed the norms around those issues, raised the discourse within Saudi Arabia, and made it easier for people to embrace changes when the government decided to go for it. So this is why it's very disturbing for me and for other Saudis to see how the government is very much vindictive in the way that it targeted those individuals, despite the crucial role that they played within the Saudi, spheres. So I just wanted to say something about torture. Now, tortures historically in Saudi Arabia have been used. It's not like a new thing. But the pattern of torture that is coming from Saudi Arabia is much more severe. Of course, the details that was leaked through Turkey about Jamal Khashoggi's murder, it just elevated, the use of torture to a new level. I think it was in May last year, the Special Rapporteur on Anti-Terror and Ben Emerson on torture has actually visited Saudi Arabia and examined the main areas in which there was some kind of problematic legal pretext or problematic procedural law that enabled the government to go after people in using torture or arbitrary arrests. He actually issued a new report, and the report and the statement is available on the website of the Human Rights Council, but I'm just going to quote one thing about his reservation and critique of the anti-terror law that is largely used to target peaceful dissidents. He quoted that any definition of terrorism should be confined to acts or threats of violence that are committed for religious, political, or ideological motives, which are aimed at putting members of the public in fear or at coercing a government or an international organization. So I see the pattern of terror that has been embraced and adopted by the new leadership in Saudi Arabia is actually an act of terror against the public. So the government, by adopting those kinds of extreme measures that are not aimed at any other point except at instilling fears in people who are daring to have some kind of criticism around the vision or the reforms or the direction of the government in any kinds of issue, those kinds of terror are very much aimed at instilling fear. And I think of that it is a state violence, is a state act of terror against the public. So one of the things that brought to my attention and to other activists as well, and through reports of different organizations, is the systematic pattern of violence that has been embraced by Saudi Arabia, and very much driven by the idea of enemies of the state. So, as you all know, Saud al-Qahtani, as a very close advisor and aide to the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has started instilling a national discourse through social media and the print media that very much encourages people to have this kind of extreme nationalist attributes, mainly characterized by trying to discredit any voice which does not really rally behind Mohammed bin Salman or rally behind the vision. And most of the voices which were targeted were actually in alignment with the reforms, in alignment with fighting corruption, in alignment with economic reforms, with women inclusion. So it was very surprising that despite the role of those activists and individuals within Saudi Arabia, they were actually targeted starting from September. And we only knew news of torture after 3 months of detention. Most of the waves of arrest happened in a very disturbing manner in which the government would go after a group of individuals. The first one happened in September last year, where most of the intellectuals, writers, people who have actually enriched the public discourse in Saudi Arabia were rounded up, including Islamic preachers who have actually supported a human rights approach, like Salman al-Auda again and Abdullah al-Maliki, who actually voted for and promoted democracy in Saudi Arabia. So it was, I think, estimated that about more than 70 individuals were rounded in that wave, and those people were kept incommunicado, and most of them in confined, imprisonment, solitary confinement, until 3 years after their arrest, and they were not allowed any access to legal representation or family visits until after the 3 months. The same thing happened with people at the Reds when the government went after, it was more or less a political purge, went after anybody who had potential political clout, whether in the media or the business or in the ruling family itself or the politics. And it was very disturbing that these arrests happened without any kinds of charges was very much orchestrated extra-legally or extrajudicially, something that happens outside the sphere of law directly by the royal court. And it was very disturbing because even though we're an absolute monarchy, at least the pretense of following certain norms and certain legal norms was supposed to be followed. But in this case, the government went really, all over the board to basically disregard any kinds of a pretense of any kinds of legal respect or respect for the rule of law. And then what happened in May was the most disturbing, because it went after women who were already silenced since September. Most of the women who were targeted were already ordered to remain silent, to refrain from engagement with the media, which have been actually happening. So all of these women were already silent. So when the government went after them, it was a very strange way, because instead of labeling them as enemy of social reforms, as the Islamists of September, or corrupted individuals like the people who were rounded in November, the government decided to brand those women as traitors. And a big smear campaign happened all over the social media and with the government-linked accounts that went after women individually and tarnished their reputation and their long-standing respect in the society. We felt like the urge to do something about it, but the fear was instilled in so many people that they couldn't really understand the motive behind that aggressive approach. And of course, it was because those who were able to defend those women were already imprisoned. Those who were able to mobilize the masses were already silenced or targeted. And it was very difficult to find people inside Saudi Arabia who can actually support and defend those people arrested or the women detained. Now, accounts of torture that I've been informed of through different sources and through organizations, that all of the women activists, and we have now around 11 women confirmed, including their 80-year-old lawyer and several men supporters who helped the women to promote their ideals. Now, all of those people, and along with 40 other individuals linked to the case, those individuals, we had no idea that they were detained, because the first thing the government do is they go after the people and tell them, if the family or anyone related to you disclose any idea about the detention or any information about the interrogation, we're going to go after the family as well, which what happened. Many of the families or those people who were targeted by the government, their families have been actually placed under legal harassments or travel bans, or sometimes imprisoned, like the case of Salman al-Auda, when his brother announced that he was detained. His brother as well was detained, and his son, I think, as well, one of the other relatives. Basically, the women were kept in a separate place, not within the prison system. So in a place which is described by some of the families as a hotel, which was weird because it's very much similar to the instance or the incident of the Reds when the government decided to take the women or take the people, business people, in a place that was not under the supervision or the control of the official security apparatus. It was under the control of the royal court directly. So my understanding is that most of the horrific acts of torture happened in the hotel. And then during that time, they were not allowed any visits by their family or any legal access to legal representation. And they were warned from disclosing anything. So in the brief phone calls that they were allowed with the families, they were not able to say anything about the accounts of torture, despite the fact that one of them have tried to commit suicide repeatedly. Now, the acts of terror or acts of torture that happened to the women, it includes sexual abuse. Some of them have been kissed, hugged, or groped by members described as people affiliated with the cybersecurity unit, which is led directly by Saud al-Qahtani. His name as an advisor of the royal court, Mohammed bin Salman directly, has come a lot in the killing of Khashoggi. And of course, that happened before Khashoggi's killing. But we only learned of the torture after information on Khashoggi was leaked to the media. Some of the women said that they were, most of the women were electrocuted. One of the women said that she was electrocuted. She's a very old woman, and she was electrocuted until her fingers were blue, and they turned blue. Basically, I don't know if it was it would cause a terminal damage to her neurological system or not. They were beating, aggressive beating. One of the women said that 6 people with Saud al-Qahtani supervising in the room were beating the women and pulling her hair, sexually abusing her. Most of the women have been subjected to severe verbal sexual abuse, severe. And people who were relaying the information, they even felt ashamed of repeating the words. So I could imagine only that it was very aggressive and very abusive. Beside the electrocution and beatings, some of the women were, according to them, were actually informed that a member of their family or another person from the detainees, their lawyer, was killed under torture. And when I asked if those acts of torture were actually aimed at trying to get information or coerce them into confessions, the women said, the people who were familiar with the women said that it was a session of torture designed as such. So it was not a session where women were asked to answer certain questions or to sign confessions. It was just done as such. It was just done as a, this is your regular session of torture. That's it. Of course, the women after 3 months were transferred to a prison. And in the prison, more women were added to the wave, like Samar Badawi, like Naseem al-Sada and Noor Abdel-Aziz, Mia Zahrani. Some of the women say that they forced one of the women to kiss another detainee, which was horrific. This kind of use of sex as a way to demonstrate or project power against the women. It's actually horrific.
Hala, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
I'm really reluctant to cut you off amidst such a litany of awful accounts, but I'm afraid just if you could wrap up in another...
I'm going to wrap it immediately. Right. And I'm going to just say that those people who relate those information took it on a very high risk. So you took a very high risk to relay those information. And it's up to the international community now to show solidarity and support those people. This act of torture is very much an indication of the brutality of the regime. It indicates how aggressive the regime is, and really it declares war of the citizens. And I think the only way to support the movement of the civil society to actually peacefully is to support those people, because first of their crucial, and second, because of the message that it would send to regime and to leaders of the region, that these acts are not accepted by leaders in a region that is very much riddled with conflicts and instability. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Thanks for ending with those calls as well, those appeals. Thanks for joining us. Will you stay around? Will you sort of listen in? Yeah, great.
I'm just going to mute until.
Thanks so much. Well, that's a rather shocking way to begin. Next, we have Khalid Ibrahim. Khalid Ibrahim runs the Gulf Center for Human Rights. He's been a Gulf activist on human rights defenders for many, many years, intervening on, indeed, some of the cases that Hala has been referring to. Over to you, Khalid.
Thank you so much, Yuri. And thanks to ALQST for Human Rights for giving me this opportunity to talk about Saudi Arabia. As you know, today is a historic day, the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Civilized countries will celebrate on this day their achievements. They talk about how they protect the human and civil rights of their citizens. But when we talk about Saudi Arabia, the picture is very sad. And you heard what my colleague Hala talked about what happened to citizens, innocent citizens, women human rights defenders who worked very peacefully to defend women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Only in June, they granted women in Saudi Arabia the right to drive a box of iron, namely a car. But all the leaders who campaigned peacefully for this basic right, they put them in prison and tortured them. My job here is to really talk about what happened to human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a member of the United Nations, elected twice to the Human Rights Council. But let us see what happened to human rights defenders in recent years in Saudi Arabia. Like, I don't know from where I start. The list is full and the time is very limited, 7 minutes. Maybe I start with the political and civil rights organization, HASM. All the co-founders of this organization, they were both on trial before the terrorism court or the specialized penal court. In 2008, this court set up to put on trial before it the members of Al-Qaeda. Instead, they put before it all the defenders, the human rights defenders. And they used the terrorism law and the cyber crimes laws to put them in prison. In Saudi Arabia, to be a defender, you are going to be treated worse than a criminal. You will face a trial on fabricated charges for sure. At least you are going to be travel banned. Saudi human rights defenders are not allowed to go to Geneva. It is impossible to get a defender from Saudi Arabia to talk to the international community. Maybe I will mention some cases. Dr. Muhammad Al-Qahtani, a very respected academic. I met him in 2003 in one of the meetings of frontline defenders. He worked with the United Nations. Some reports about violations that committed against ordinary citizens and what happened publicly Saudi Arabia. They put it in the vertex against Dr. Al-Qahtani. One of the charges, working with the United Nations. He's in prison for 10 years for his peaceful and legitimate work. Maybe I move to Khalid Al-Umair, this innocent defender. He was sentenced to 10 years. He spent the 10 years in prison. And he managed to know the name of the officer who tortured him. And he peacefully went to make a complaint. And what happened? He disappeared for weeks and months. He's still in prison just because he made a complaint against the officer who tortured him. So I could say, for sure, there is a systematic failure of justice in Saudi Arabia. A lot of cases, a lot of people who are in prison and they don't know for how long and when they are going to put on trial. That is the situation in Saudi Arabia, a very close country. I called the Minister of Justice to get a fax number to send them an appeal. They refused even to give me the number. They closed the line. They didn't want to speak to me. That is the reality about Saudi Arabia. Maybe I speak about two other defenders, Muhammad Al-Utaybi and Abdullah Al-Attawi, two peaceful citizens. They set up a human rights organization called Union for Human Rights. They are in prison now just because they set up a human rights organization. That is Saudi Arabia, the member of the Human Rights Council. They have no legislation to authorize human rights organizations to work peacefully for human rights. Al-Adala Center, they refused to give the co-founders permission to work for human rights, and also has the political and civil rights organization. They also refuse to give them any permit to work for human rights. Instead, if you are going to work for human rights, you are going to face a charge in the terrorism court of illegal membership of an organization. So that is how Saudi Arabia is treating the vendors. I could speak about the use of the most sophisticated software and hardware that they imported from some Western companies to monitor online activisms. A very sophisticated attack on online activists. A lot of them, they are in prison because of a tweet or a post or a YouTube video. Maybe I speak about Marwan al-Marisi, this writer. He has more than 100 followers. And this will show for you what kind of respect the Saudi authorities have for the other views. It is in the very heart of human rights that you respect the other views. You hear the other views because it's a sign of richness in the society. Marwan al-Marisi talked about, you know, in a way or another, he didn't agree about this 2030 vision. He's in prison now for his views. And there are a lot more about the vendors who are in prison just because they have given views that are not the same as of the government. If we speak about the media, the traditional media is owned by the Saudi government, probably on occasion by the intelligence service itself, the al-Mabahith. And then when people went to social media to express their views, they faced with the cyber crimes laws in order to just silence them and put them in prison. If we speak about legislation, terrorism law, as I said, and cyber crimes law are used to silence citizens. If we speak about detained human rights defenders, really, they are even inside the prison. We have a lot of information about the way they are treated. They have few visits. They are not having access to their families. And if they are not on trial, then it is very hard. On many occasions, they are incommunicado, as my colleague Hala said. If we speak about some other cases, serious cases, Isra al-Ghumqam, she's facing death penalty. Why? Just because she protested peacefully in the streets of Al-Qatif. Not only Isra, also her husband, Musa Hashim, and 3 of their colleagues, who are really just peacefully protested in the streets of Al-Qatif. The case of Khashoggi, it was not a surprise for us. We know what's going on in this country. We know the brutality of the ruling family. We know that there's no justice. We know that the judiciary is headed by the king, and the judges are free to sentence defenders for whatever period they want, and almost 5 years, 10 years, 15 years for people who are working peacefully for human rights. Now, I would like to talk also about the need to end impunity and to promote a culture of accountability for all perpetrators in Saudi Arabia. This needs a lot of help. We have some cases that were documented. We know some perpetrators, but as you know, there is no any local remedy, and we are trying to explore the way of using a foreign judiciary to put some of those perpetrators behind bars in a court of justice. Now, there are a lot of other issues, but I stop here to say that, and to conclude to say that really it is not that we are hopeless. We are not going to lose the hope that the change is coming. It is just taking time. It may take long time, but with our collective work, with our cooperation with governments that are supporting human rights in Saudi Arabia, we could get success. We see some signs of success. The Canadian government is trying to, behind the scenes, to put a lot of pressure on the Saudi authorities to release the women human rights defenders and others. We have to work hard to get to that point in which we could force a positive change in Saudi Arabia. The task is difficult, is heavy, but with collective work, I think it's possible. And also, I would like to conclude by saying that organizations such as ALQST and other organizations like Muwatan in Yemen, they need a lot of support. We have to support the localization of the work of human rights in these countries. It is not for observers who are outside the region to document violation. We need people on the ground. Now that the first generation of defenders left the job, or they are in prison, or they are covered bond, we need to create another generation of defenders. We need to support the new emerging organizations to do the job. I stop here, and I hope that we will have a healthy discussion.
Thanks so much, Khalid. Thanks so much. That's Human Rights Defenders. We're turning to RSF, Reporters Without Borders, ideally by telephone. Telephone only, I'm afraid. Sophie Anmut, who's the head of the Middle East desk there, can only join us by phone. And I think she's being joined now. There's bound to be some technical hitches with this. There we go. Right now. So this is Sophie Anmut, who's the head of the Middle East desk at Reporters Without Borders. She's in Paris.
Hi, good evening, Sophie. You may start.
About 5 minutes maximum, Sophie, if you can hear me.
Sophie, 5 minutes. You may start.
6 minutes just to start.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no worries. I can hear you fine. I won't be very long because most of what I wanted to say anyway has already been said. So, sorry, there's a... I can hear myself because I was watching the conference. At NSF, we have documented at least 28 cases of journalists or citizen journalists currently behind bars, and as you already said, most of them are in pre-trial detention, and many of them have undergone terrible torture or interrogation. Of course, the case of Jamal Khashoggi has startled the whole world, and of course we still ask for an international investigation into his case, and that the people who committed or ordered his murder be held to account, as you all do here, of course, all the speakers. I also wanted to remind, as you said, the audience that one of the people we consider as a blogger, Salman El-Auda, was also, of course, a thinker and a reformist. The death penalty has been asked for him. One journalist is still disappeared. Fayez Ben Damar is probably been extradited from Kuwait. Most of the journalists currently working in Saudi Arabia are basically, it's expected from them that they are just propagandists. Because, of course, as you said, they try and express themselves on the social media, and it has been heavily censored and monitored. So many have been arrested because of, you already said it, cybercrime laws, but also because of terrorism laws. And it's not only Saudi Arabia, of course, which uses this excuse in the region or even in the world to arrest journalists, unfortunately. But also journalists are self-censoring because of fear, because they can get interrogated, they can see what happens to other people who speak up, they can be under a travel ban, or their voices are simply completely drawn out in regime-supporting propaganda.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks very much. Are you wrapping up there?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you continue to watch online.
Yes, I will.
Bye for now. Thanks for joining us.
Waiting for answers, questions if you...
Indeed, when we get to the questions. Thanks, thanks, Sophie. Turning now to somebody in the room. Julia Legner is with the MENA Rights Group. Thank you. A newly founded organization based in Geneva. Many years of working with the UN in particular, I think. And over to you, Julia. Thank you.
I've been asked today to speak about Saudi Arabia at the Human Rights Council, or the UN system, and how one can address grievances of human rights violations to the UN. And well, I think I'll start by saying that there is the UN petition system, so a complaint procedure, or basically 3 individual complaint procedures established under the Human Rights Council. And each plays a distinct role, and each has weaknesses and strengths, and maybe we can discuss them in further length later. Firstly, there are the special procedures and the UN working groups, made up of independent experts focusing either on country situations, such as the occupied Palestinian territories, or the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, or the Special Rapporteur on Torture, that will receive complaints of individual human rights violations, regardless of the convention Saudi Arabia has ratified or hasn't. The special procedures also have another function, which is to visit any of the 193 UN member states, inquiring about human rights violations, depending on the mandate that they hold. To meet stakeholders on the ground, to visit institutions, and to get a better idea of the human rights violations on the ground. Then there are treaty body complaints. I'm not going to go into length with this. And then there's also a confidential complaint procedure of the Human Rights Council. I would now like to speak about one of the latest reviews that Saudi Arabia has undergone in the recent time, which is the UN Universal Periodic Review. This is a review that takes place every 4 to 5 years and examines the human rights performance of all UN member states. It's a peer review. That means it's the other UN member states that review the country under review, which also, I guess, makes it a bit of a political process. But the review itself is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the treaties that the country under review has ratified. And Saudi Arabia has been reviewed last on 5th November 2018. During this review, 96 member states made recommendations on a wide range of topics, including the death penalty, counterterrorism legislation, freedom of expression and association, women's rights, the ratification or the lack of ratification of international human rights treaties, and of course the war in Yemen. Well, this cycle of the UPR witnessed some unusually strong recommendations, which reflects the deterioration of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, but also, of course, the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. In fact, over 20 countries raised concerns about the extrajudicial killing of Jamal Khashoggi, with many reiterating the UN High Commissioner's call for the launch of an impartial and effective investigation into his killing. Over 15 countries also made recommendations to Saudi Arabia to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other core international human rights treaties. Many recommendations issued pointed towards the need for legal reform, with the example of Norway calling on Saudi Arabia to ensure that the country's counterterrorism legislation complies with international human rights norms. Other recommendations were issued to amend the cybercrime law, the law on associations, all the laws that are used to crack down on peaceful dissent. Moreover, several recommendations were also issued with regard to the ongoing conflict in Yemen, with Germany and France urging the Saudi authorities to take all possible measures to protect civilians in Yemen and ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, as well as to ensure full and total consideration of international humanitarian law. Then I would like to speak about another UN mechanism, or come back to the special procedures as mentioned before, and their ability to visit countries. Basically, this is only the third time that happens in the history that an independent expert is visiting Saudi Arabia, and I'm referring to the last visit by what was also mentioned by my colleague Hala, the special rapporteur on human rights while countering terrorism, Ben Emerson, who managed to visit Saudi Arabia in late April, early May of last year. This came as a bit of a surprise because it's obviously a mandate that is very relevant to Saudi Arabia, as many peaceful activists are being prosecuted under counterterrorism law. But Ben Emerson, the former rapporteur, came to Saudi Arabia on an initial visit that was not an official visit, to try and assure the Saudi authorities that his findings would not be too harsh, or he would also make an effort to praise the improvements that Saudi Arabia has made or claims to have made. And then he was allowed an official visit, and that was concluded by a very harsh report that I think all of us in the human rights world celebrated, because it really contained very strong criticism of well, the practices used by Saudi Arabia under the pretext of countering terrorism. He, amongst other things, criticized the unacceptably broad definition of terrorism that is used to crack down on peaceful activists, the application of the death penalty after confessions extracted under torture, also the application of the death penalty following proceedings that are not in line with international fair trial standards, and also the new counterterrorism law that was adopted, that is in 2017, that is an even more draconian law used to silence civil society. And he also referred to extraterritorial activities of Saudi Arabia with their involvement in Yemen, and condemned these acts, and he called into question Saudi Arabia's membership on the Human Rights Council. So this is when we start hearing voices within the UN calling on Saudi Arabia to be suspended from the Human Rights Council. So Saudi Arabia is now serving its 4th term on the Council, which obviously is not to any of our liking, because Saudi Arabia is not known to promote and respect the highest standards of human rights as it is expected from UN, from the members sitting on the Council. And I think civil society, we've made some attempts already to raise this issue and to possibly have Saudi Arabia suspended from the Council. That is not as easy as it sounds. It needs a 2/3 majority from the General Assembly. So for that, one would have to really intensively lobby UN member states that are on the General Assembly. Saudi's current term is coming to an end in 2019, and because it has already served 2 years on the Council, it cannot directly be re-elected. Which means that at least there is a chance for us in civil society to make sure Saudi won't get re-elected in 2020. I have a few concluding remarks. So the UN human rights system has its strength and its weaknesses. But we have in recent times, and that is not just since the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but really in the last 1.5 years since the accession of the new Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to power, seen stronger criticism voiced also from within the UN, from individual experts, groups of experts, member states, that don't just condemn the diverse human rights violations, as we've already heard. Some crack down on human rights defenders, anyone critical of the regime, torture, the death penalty, sometimes used against minors and after grossly unfair trials. But also, I think the calls for action become more precise. For example, as mentioned, Ben Emerson and others in recent times have called into question Saudi's membership on the Council. We've heard more calls for the need of a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. And while some parts of the UN system, as mentioned, remain vulnerable to political manipulation and politicization, the UN system is a way to put pressure on the Saudi government, as is media, as is international public advocacy as well. So I think the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has created a momentum that has shown to what tactics Saudi Arabia is able to resolve in order to maintain power and to silence critics. And it's an important point, I think, that we now make everyone understand that this is not an isolated incident. These are the tactics that the Saudi authorities are using against their own citizens in Saudi Arabia and now sometimes also abroad. And in recent discussions with Saudi activists themselves, it has become clear that while reporting violations can lead to reprisals against individuals and their families, pressure by the UN and the international community can also add another layer of protection and can lead to positive change, or at least to not a further deterioration of an individual situation. Also, staying silent doesn't seem to be an option anymore, because as we've seen in the recent crackdown, even people that stayed considerably silent, I mean, if I recall the case of Samar Badawi or Mohammed Bjadi, that have refrained from activism in recent months and years, they've still been arrested, they're still being targeted. So in view of the ruthless crackdown of the government, one cannot stay silent anymore. And I think the conference also held yesterday by Diwan London, in which dozens of Saudi activists from a wide spectrum of society have participated in, discussing the future of Saudi society, confirms that statement that we cannot stay silent. And it also sends a very strong message to the Saudi regime that Saudi society will and cannot be silenced. And as human rights organizations, we're here to support them. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks very much. Coming away with a very strong sense that there's a development with Saudi Arabian society in and of itself, yet this blockage of the government, yet the UN being able to possibly do a little bit. I'm afraid we've got the next three speakers are going to be joining by Skype. They can't be here with us today. First is Ali Dubisi from Berlin. There he is. He is the director of the European Saudi Organization for Human Rights. They've done a lot of work on the death penalty. I hope Ali can hear us. Excellent. Thank you. Ali, 5 to 6 minutes at best, please, if you can. I know there's a lot to go through.
All the solidarity with our sister to organize this important time. We cannot say that we are not sad, we are not angry, we cannot say another things. Khalid Ibrahim, one of the respected friends for me, always when I speak with him, when he speak with you also, you will note him quiet. But in this time, I saw Mr. Khalid, and I saw another group or friends here. They cannot become not angry with the last development in Saudi Arabia. There is unusual violation and crime by government in this time. Comparing all their history, we didn't find it. At the moment, Saudi Arabia in the top of the difficult and complex country with regard to the human rights situation. Difficult and complex, this is the description used by former High Commissioner Mr. Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein in March 2018 when he described his relation with Saudi Arabia. After 4 years, he spent in High Commissioner. This unusual from Zaid diplomacy, and the reason is Saudi behavior. In addition to the crimes and violation committed by Saudi Arabia for human rights, it guards this violation with several barriers. Sorry, I cannot introduce my speech with 5 or 6 minutes because I program it with 10 minutes. Please, little patient. First of all, Saudi Arabia lying, as all people noted after Khashoggi cases, for example. Also media disinformation. Also defective laws, such as the anti-terrorism and the cybercrime laws. Also, Saudi Arabia approximately stopped all the space for civil society. For example, almost no activists from Saudi Arabia attend session of the Human Rights Council, and the absence of those voices, so that some of the existence voices, it looks lonely or abnormal. Also misguided diplomatic, for example, they use National Human Rights Society inside Saudi Arabia to meeting with foreign diplomatic delegation to feed them with misleading information. Also, there is short or minor or phantom steps which they effort as reform to silence the world, such as the system that they developed from time to time, like NGO laws in November 2015. Also, the money they distributed everywhere and instilling political fear in the people to reduce criticism or to reduce demand for change. For example, in Saudi Arabia, have been published widely the phrase, "Do you want happen to us as what's happening in Syria?" They use this and they promote this sentence widely in Saudi Arabia, especially after 2012 and till now. Also the prison and death and threat and torture and stop government service and travel ban, all this daily practice in Saudi Arabia, and the tricks and deception for the outside and inside people. The deeper problem for us in Saudi is political. The Saud's family want to exercise their authority in a dictatorial and corrupt way, with absolute control over the wealth and management of the country. They realize that to the extent that they respect human rights, this will reduce their control. This is what they understand. This fact is very, very important for any activist or organization want working in Saudi Arabia human rights field. We need to remember all the time the family of Al Saud, they look at human rights change or reform as shrinking for their authority. The behavior of the family has not only made the positive result of a human rights work slow or limited, but also has led to some aspects that worst in the history of the country. Of course, this does not mean in any way the work of a human rights organization and activists not good, but means that we are in front of very enemy of a human rights, and we need to renew and stop to think. I will therefore like to go into the idea that I think important now in this time, in the context of our human rights work. As a people from Saudi Arabia, also as organization and activists interested about human rights in Saudi. I will mention 7 practices which are not new, but I think it needs more attention. First step, predict events. The majority of existing work of our NGO comes after the violation happening, but we can do some event before that. For example, now we are waiting death penalty for 58 victims in Saudi Arabia, including Sheikh Salman Al-Auda and the human rights women defender Isra Al-Ghumgham. We are waiting the sentences, but we need before the sentence a lot of work to closing the chance for Saudi Arabia to sentence them by death penalty, for example. Also now, the women defenders in Saudi Arabia, their trial will start soon. We need a lot of awareness, a lot of pressure before their trial started, before the sentences issue, not waiting after the sentence issue, then the reform will be like, or advocacy will be difficult. Second point, the tendency of independent legal analysis and studies to reform the defective laws and to provide heavy evidence of the error of Saudi practice, such as the terrorism law, anti-cybercrime law, special criminal court in Saudi Arabia, because sometimes we seem to accept the fate of Accompli and we are like adjust ourselves with this root problem in Saudi Arabia when we only speaking about the result, not about the root. Third point, focus on parliament much more than governments and foreign ministries. For example, we are not citizens in a lot of countries around the world. When we speak with their government, they speak with us diplomacy, but the result we didn't find at the end because we are not vote for them, we are not part of the decision in this country. For that, I think the focus with different parliaments around the world better than spend a lot of effort with government. Fourth point, we need to use some part of our effort to promoting our work more than only working. Some of organization here, they spend months with some report, but when we going to publish, when we going to promote, we only use a tweet with picture, with link, and that's it. No attention around some our important work. For that, we need to use more than our time instead of only research and report to aware about our work, to publish, to use our report to make more awareness. The fifth point, organization that they have media section, they need promote all the work maybe for the organizations, for the activists. We need actually to contact more with media instead of waiting the media following and searching for our work or contact with us. We need more use our offices or some organization, they have enough capacity to contact with media to promoting our work. The sixth point, we need
to stop you is what I need to do. Because you've sat up for 10 minutes, you're on 10 minutes now, so this is your last
exception of death penalty.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, Ali, please come to a
last
conclusion.
Point, the second point is strengthen our alliance. As this meeting, we need maybe another meeting, internal meeting between those organizations and another to planning for our work internally and strategy and for long time. Sorry for over the time, and thank you for your patience and listening.
Yeah, thanks, man. Well, at least Ali did end with some recommendations, and I think actually what I've been hearing, Khaled ended on a positive points about sort of bigging up and talking about human rights defenders more so. I've written down 5 points, including those that Ali has talked about. Julia referred to, Julia talked about the uses, the mechanisms in the UN that I think we can also probably make a lot more use of. One of the main things that I took away from Ali's talk was parliaments. I mean, yeah, governments are really difficult to work with, and indeed parliaments have got some power, and maybe we should be working with them a bit more. And I think probably one thing, something that you've all touched on a little bit, is this kind of notion that more campaigning, coordination, awareness, media. Ali kind of was a little bit of hint of a criticism there against maybe some organizations about spending a lot of time on a report but not actually getting very much out of it. So some stuff to take away from there. Hopefully Adam Kugel from one of those big human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, will be with us, and he seems to be with us. Adam, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Great.
How you doing, Drury?
Great, Adam. Thanks for joining us. Adam Kugel's long-term senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. I think he's based in Amman, Jordan, and he's going to talk to us about Saudi Arabia, I hope.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk a little bit. The topic I was given was administration of justice, and it's something that at Human Rights Watch we've worked on for quite a while, and I think many of the other organizations here have as well. But I think it's important, given what's going on right now, particularly the fact that so many people who were arrested over the last year under Mohammed bin Salman's crackdowns are coming up for trial, some of them in actually capital cases. It's a really good idea to sort of go back over some of the issues around administration of justice, point out some of the problem areas, and perhaps as a group, as we go forward, brainstorm, what to do about it, which admittedly is extremely challenging. So the first thing I want to say is I'll divide this, and I promise not to go 10 minutes. I'll divide this between abuses or issues before trial and issues that happen sort of during trials. So before trials, I think it's one of the, if not the major essential element to look at here is the fact that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a penal code, and the written criminal regulations that it does have tend to define crimes very broadly. So Saudis, especially when it comes to speech crimes or crimes related to perhaps human rights activism or political dissent, it's really hard for them to know what the red lines are, what would be the threshold for causing the authorities to go after them or not. There's no way for them to know, right? I think perhaps this has become a little bit clearer under Mohammed bin Salman, just because sort of any criticism is harshly punished. But historically, I will say, this has been difficult to know. So there's no penal code, and the written criminal regulations are extremely vague. Another issue is the way in which Saudi Arabia's prosecutors tend to use the investigation process prior to arrest as almost a way to browbeat and threaten people. It's essentially a practice in intimidation. And I know this from interlocutors like Samar Bedawi, who told me over the years that the prosecutors would call her, over a 2-3 year period, they would call her every 3-4 months to come in for an investigation session, just to sort of intimidate her and tell her, hey, we're watching you, right? It wasn't a real investigation. It was just a continuing practice of intimidation. I also remember an anecdote from our friend Mohammed Artabi, unfortunately, who's in detention and just recently had his very long jail sentence upheld, who said that he basically had in 2013 signed a pledge saying that he would stop his human rights activism, and by and large he had done that, although he stayed in communication with many of us. He says that the case went silent until he randomly ran into his prosecutor in a restaurant, and his prosecutor saw him, and suddenly, about a month later, he got new charges, which gives you just a sense of how this process is completely ad hoc and haphazard. So those are some of the issues. Another issue that happens before trial is the real problem of arbitrary detention. At HRW, we've done analyses into Saudi Arabia's online prisoner database, and they actually show some pretty staggering statistics. For example, we did, I think, an analysis last April, and we found 2,305 people who had been, quote unquote, under investigation for over 6 months. 1,875 who had been under investigation and in detention, of course, for more than a year, and 251 individuals who were still under investigation for over 3 years. And we know that because the database has dates of detention and case status. And we see this, of course, with human rights defenders as well. For example, the women who are currently in detention since May have not faced formal charges, as far as I'm aware, although they've been kind of threatened with charges through the media. So who knows how long their detention will go on before they're actually brought before a judge. Salman al-Auda and some of the others waited for over a year before the cases were finally brought, about a month or two ago. So in just very quickly, with regards to criminal trials, there are also a host of issues. There's no way for me to get to them all. But just in terms of criminal trials, from what I've seen, I'll divide between trials for lower level offenses, and then trials involving the specialized criminal court, which generally try cases involving terrorism or political dissidents, human rights activists, and so on and so forth. In terms of the lower level trials, we've actually done a lot of work with foreigners who have been through the criminal justice system in Saudi Arabia, and they describe an incredibly pernicious process whereby they're brought in for low-level crimes, and we interviewed mostly Pakistanis in Pakistan who had returned home. And they described a process by which they're brought in for a crime, whether it's alcohol consumption, check forgery, any number of kind of low-level crimes. They're held in detention for very long periods of time. No one really tells them anything about what's happening or what their status is. They usually confess right at the beginning to police. So they can be held for many months. They're finally dragged before a judge. A judge essentially says, this is your crime and this is your punishment. Do you accept it or not? And some of them accept it and serve their sentence and move on. And some of them want to defend themselves. So they say, no, I don't accept it. So the judge says, okay, you can prepare a defense, but you have to go back to jail. So they go back to jail. They work with other detainees to try to prepare a defense. They're brought back before the judge, maybe 2-3 months later, and the judge just presents the same judgment to them and says, okay, do you accept your sentence? And they say no. And he says, okay, well, you have to go back to detention. And they described how this process would happen over and over and over again, where the sentences were predetermined, and they had merely to accept them or to remain in arbitrary detention for extremely long periods of time. So all of them, in the cases we saw, ended up just accepting them, serving whatever sentence they were given, not defending themselves, and then processing out eventually. So those are some of the issues with the lower level. And also, it should be said, nearly all of them did not have lawyers, not because they couldn't get lawyers, but because it was very just challenging for them in detention to find Saudis who could represent them. But generally, the courts would allow the presence of a lawyer in those cases. In terms of the more serious crimes involving the specialized criminal court, there are also some very serious issues that we've just seen over and over the years. Number one, and I think most importantly, it's not a particularly independent institution. Technically, it is independent. However, it previously had a very clear association with the Ministry of Interior. And then when Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman reorganized the counterterrorism in the security sector in the summer of 2017, he moved most of those powers to the Presidency of State Security, and now there's sort of an unhealthy, non-independent relationship between the Presidency of State Security and the Specialized Criminal Court, which is involved in most of these cases I think that we're talking about. In terms of the Specialized Criminal Court, one of the major issues we've seen is the reliance on torture-tainted confessions to convict detainees and to sentence them for long jail periods or even in many cases to death. And I've seen, I think I've read probably about up to 20 to 25 of these judgments in which detainees tell the judge, tell the court, you know, I made my confession under duress. And the judges repeatedly cite the same hadith report to say that you cannot withdraw a legally given statement in what's known as a discretionary case. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but in general, they say you can't retract your confessions, and they don't investigate the allegations, and then they move on and convict the detainees, often in the absence of any other piece of evidence, only the torture-tainted confession. So we've seen that over and over again, especially involving Eastern Province protesters. And just in terms of the independence of the court, you know, I don't know exactly who the judges are or what their record is, but I can say, you know, in general, you just don't see people who are involved in cases involving, you know, human rights activism or political dissidents such as Salman al-Awda. You just don't see them ruled innocent. I've never seen it. And in fact, typically when these cases are appealed, the appeals court has a tendency not only to not exonerate, but to increase sentences that have been imposed by the lower court. So I think those, I've given some of the major issues, and I think I'll just stop there, but, you know, happy to discuss further going forward.
Adam, thanks very much. Just one really quick question before you go. The research that you referred to in respect to the online database, is that published?
So it's funny. I mean, it goes through phases where it's public, and it goes through phases where they take it down. Right now, we've been in about a 2 or 3 month period where it's been taken down off the internet. I think if you have a VPN with a Saudi node, you can access it because it's accessible inside Saudi Arabia. But right now, unfortunately, last I checked, it's not accessible outside.
Thanks, Adam. Will you stay around for the discussion a little bit later on and mute in the meantime? Thanks so much. Now we will go to Paris with Yasmin Lavey, and I think she's trying to get through to me, actually. Have you got her? So Yasmin is at the FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights. I think she recently completed a doctorate, if I'm not mistaken, at LSE. I could be wrong. Oh, she's messaged me to say that she's here ready to go. Okay, great. There's Yasmin. Great.
Good to see you, even if it's just virtually.
Yes, all the time.
Yasmin, we're running. Sorry,
hello, everybody. Yeah.
We're running a little bit over time. If maximum 7 minutes, if you could, if you possibly can.
I'll do my best. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that's perfect. So first, I would like to thank you for inviting us to attend this very important meeting. We more than ever need this kind of solidarity and this kind of discussion, and I hope it will be a fruitful discussion regarding next steps, because we are in a very difficult situations, just like all the colleagues have described very well. So FIDH has released a report on the situation of women human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia last January, so almost a year ago. The report detailed how women human rights defenders were confronted to the continuous repression of the regime and to the various restrictions to freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. As women, they faced multiple forms of discrimination, including the male guardianship system. And so our report clearly denounced the male guardianship system and called for its abolition. And this work was the basis for a large advocacy campaign that we held throughout this year with our partners, including ALQST, in Geneva, Brussels, and beyond. And we took all the advocacy opportunities that we had to raise the difficult situation of activists, men and women in Saudi Arabia, the arrest, the harsh sentences, terrorism charges, cyber criminality charges. We also raised that despite its considerable efforts to improve its image on the international scene, including at the UN Human Rights Council, Saudi Arabia kept violating women's rights and repressing human rights defenders. We urged Saudi Arabia to adopt true reforms to favor women's rights and not just symbolic measures such as the right to drive, to enter stadiums, and announcements that have often seemed to aim at diverting the attention of Saudi Arabian citizens and the international community from human rights violations perpetrated in the country and abroad. So we clearly asked for the revision of the law on associations and foundations of 2015, and we asked for the abolition of the male guardianship system. So where do we stand a year after initiating this campaign? Unfortunately, today, not only prospects for positive change remain very, very far, but also the human rights situation has considerably deteriorated, including for human rights defenders, both men and women, and now impunity is total. Nearly all the women human rights defenders that we mentioned in our report, including some women who participated in some advocacy efforts with us, almost all these women are now detained in Saudi Arabia. And the wave of arrests and attacks against all dissidents or perceived as dissidents continue. And space for civil society in Saudi Arabia has never been so closed. Freedoms of association, assembly, expression remain completely non-existent. We are also worried about the rise of death penalty, and we are worried about the next hearing of the trial that happens in January of Isra al-Homham and other protesters who may be sentenced to death simply for exercising their right to protest. So far, the international mobilization against such grave violations of human rights, such as the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has shown, this international mobilization remains very scarce, and the Saudi Arabian regime is far from being isolated internationally. Violations and huge international crimes continue in Yemen. And the intense and unprecedented repression of Saudi Arabian activists may make us and everyone also put aside the still worsening human rights situation in the country, including women's rights and all kinds of discriminations. So what are next steps? We have so many challenges ahead. And I would like here just to raise some thoughts and open questions for discussion. How should we reinforce our movement in favor of human rights in Saudi Arabia? How should we better coordinate our actions? I totally agree with Ali when he said that it's good that that many organizations do research and write reports, but then what? I think there is really a need to unite and to build a common strategy, to exchange information, to share lessons learned and good practices. So how do we do that? We also have a serious security challenge. How do we communicate? How do we meet safely? How do we respond to the danger, indeed, of surveillance technologies that were sold to Saudi Arabia, as Khalid said, by many foreign and Western companies that are backed by their governments. Shall we go against the states who allow such kinds of experts, because these states may be breaching their international human rights commitments? How do we mobilize against potential death sentences, including in January? How do we reactivate our mobilization for women's rights? Which advocacy targets shall we prioritize? Because so far, of course, we've been prioritizing states like the US, France, the UK also happen to be the biggest arms providers to Saudi Arabia, and who also happen to have seats at the UN Security Council. How do we improve our media outreach and our communication? Because the image of Saudi Arabia has never been so damaged. And despite all our efforts, nothing seems to be changing for its key international partners. And lastly, how do we fight against this impunity? And how do we hold perpetrators of such grave human rights violations accountable? How do we build cases for litigation purposes? Shall we use extraterritorial jurisdiction to incriminate high Saudi Arabian officials? And which impact can we reasonably expect? So I don't have, I'm afraid, the right solutions myself alone, but I hope to have raised some useful questions, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Yasmin. Will you stay around for the discussion afterwards? After the break? For our penultimate speaker, we're coming back into the room. Slightly different hat. Anne Felton from the Campaign Against the Arms Trade.
Thank you. I mean, in case people don't know about Campaign Against Arms Trade, it has been going since 1974. It was set up by other organisations such as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, a Catholic Peace Group, Pax Christi, the Quakers, the United Nations Association and others, who all found themselves working on arms export issues after the war in the Middle East in the previous year. So we've been going since 1974. Over half of UK arms supplies go to the Middle East, and of those countries, Saudi Arabia is by far the largest customer. In fact, it's by far the largest customer for UK arms. And we've always argued that not only do these arms sales actually provide Saudi Arabia with deadly means, but they also, with those sales, they render the UK government silent and talking out about human rights in Saudi Arabia, or at the very least, very muted. And the UK government and the UK companies have always been desperate for further deals, so that kind of has continued over the years. The arms trade between, the arms sales from the UK to Saudi Arabia started in the 1960s, but really took off in the mid-1980s. And that was because Western governments wanted to recycle Saudi oil wealth. They wanted to bring some of it back to the West. The US was slightly tied up because of the pro-Israel lobby in Washington that didn't like to see the arming of Saudi too far. So, in essence, the UK government was given the go-ahead. The UK was given the go-ahead. There have been two very big contracts with Saudi Arabia. the Al Yamama ones, which were for Tornado jets and Hawk jets, and they were in the mid-1980s. And then more recently, there's been the Salam project, which is the sale of Eurofighter Typhoons, and that sort of was signed off in stages between about 2007 and 2014. You often see an arms deal is reported more than once because there's an initial agreement and then there's more detailed agreements and then the financing agreements and things can take years. They're never kind of a quick sale. They're always very long. And I think it's really important to note that it isn't just the aircraft that goes, but as part of the deal, there's the ongoing support and refurbishing. Now, for all these deals, the contracts are between the UK government and the Saudi Arabian government. And then there's another kind of back-to-back contract between the UK government and the main contractor on these deals, which is the company that is now BAE Systems. And BAE will actually get some of the other supplies in from other companies, but it's a government-to-government deal. And in the kind of pushing of those deals, there's always been huge amounts of UK government support. The Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, David Cameron, and now Theresa May have all kind of been out to Saudi Arabia trying to flog aircraft. And when I said that the deals take some time, often to finalise, and when the Saudis wouldn't completely sign off on the Salam project in 2014, Prince Charles was dispatched to do a sword dance in Saudi Arabia and to get the clinch that the finances, and that was kind of signed 2 days after he went there. Although he's reportedly quite recently said he's not, one of the kind of little snippets that came out on his 70th birthday blurb in the papers, that he was no longer prepared to be an arms salesman in the Middle East. But we shall see. Using the royal family has been one of the things they've done. As I said, they are government-to-government contracts, and within the UK Ministry of Defence, civil servants and military personnel working both in the UK and in Saudi Arabia, they really support these deals. And there's well over 200 of these people. They are working within the UK Ministry of Defence, but the Saudi government picks up the bill. That's how close they are. And the biggest project is MODSAP, which is the Saudi Ministry of Defence Saudi Armed Forces project. That looks after the Eurofighter Typhoons and the remnants of the Tornado deal. But there's also a smaller project, the Saudi Arabia National Guard Communications project. That one's come, well, both projects have had allegations of corruption around them. The big project was kicked into the long grass. I mean, Tony Blair said you can't continue any more investigating, so that one was dropped. But in fact, this smaller one, the communications project, the Serious Fraud Office is still investigating. So that the government, there's a kind of strong bit of government, the UK government, that is working on these deals all the time. Also, BAE Systems itself has 6,100 employees in Saudi Arabia, supporting the operational capabilities of the Royal Saudi Air Force. And we don't actually know if they're actually loading the missiles, but there are that have been dropped on Yemen. But we do know that there are jobs of bomb loading supervisors being advertised. People have picked that up from recruitment websites and things. So it's very much a kind of, they're really embedded in there with Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia, because it's the biggest customer for UK arms, has consistently been a focus for campaign against arms trade over the years. And in fact, it's so big a customer that if you actually manage to stop the arms trade with Saudi Arabia, basically you've stopped the UK as an arms exporter, because it's just so big. Till 2015, our focus was on Saudi Arabia as a human rights violator. Because, as I said earlier, we were arguing that even if the equipment isn't used, it's still sending this message of support. There are arms export controls, but what UK government is going to say that it's not following its own export controls if it is promoting the arms so strongly. And in fact, if you look, although some people say that the UK government, and in fact the European controls, say that you can't export to a country, you know, for human rights violators, if you actually read it in detail, it's only if that little bit of equipment is specifically being used for human rights violations. So thumbscrews are out, but the whole kind of support that goes with a fighter jet package, that's completely fine. And as I say, it mutes any criticism of Saudi Arabia because they are so determined for the next deal. We did think that after the war in Yemen started in March 2015, maybe that would be enough to make the UK government think again. After all, from about 2 months into that war, we were getting consistent reports of serious violations of international humanitarian law by the Saudis. Either they were deliberately targeting civilians, or they were being supremely careless in hitting hospitals, etc. We did think that might have an effect, but it didn't. So Campaign Against Arms Trade has mounted a legal challenge because another bit of the arms export controls is that if there are serious violations of international humanitarian law, then they shouldn't be exporting the arms. We took it to court. A High Court hearing was heard in February 2017 and we lost in the High Court. We've appealed and that is being heard in April 2019, that appeal in the Court of Appeal. It takes a stupendously long time to get anything through the legal system. So at the same time, we're also putting pressure on Parliament. And I think it's really encouraging that all the opposition parties, all the major opposition parties in the UK have policy on not to supply arms to Saudi Arabia where they might be used in Yemen. A lot of the opposition, I think pretty well all the opposition parties have also been very outspoken on human rights abuses. And I think one thing the Jamal Khashoggi case did, I mean, we found it slightly shocking that you can kill tens of thousands of people in Yemen and nobody takes the blindest bit of notice. Other people on death row or being executed in Saudi Arabia, very little happens, and then one man is killed in Istanbul. But the good thing about that, if you can say anything good coming out of a tragedy, is that it's really dragged public opinion and the media onto the case of Saudi Arabia. And somebody said to me the other day, who's done a lot of study in Saudi Arabia, it has liberated the mainstream media to criticise the Saudi regime in a way that hasn't happened before. So it's now become completely acceptable to kind of say anything, well, just to spread the truth about Saudi Arabia. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Anne. That's thank you. Our last speaker for tonight, hopefully joining us from Beirut via Skype again, is Dana.
That's us.
She is. Dana is the researcher on Saudi Arabia for Amnesty International. She's in Beirut. Dana, 5 to 6 minutes if you could. A little bit more would allow, of course.
Hi, Barry, and thank you for this panel. And thanks to all the panelists. I'm going to talk about the role of Western allies in the past year and in giving a green light for the continued violations on human rights. As this past year has seen an unabated crackdown on human rights in the country, every month has seen an escalation on all fronts and a crackdown on civil society and on human rights. The gruesome murder of Jamal Khashoggi this October has shown us how far the Saudi Arabian authorities will go to silence dissent and any critical voice in the country. This murder sent a shockwave among the general public and specifically among Saudi Arabian human rights defenders, journalists, and dissidents everywhere, reinforcing the notion that no one is safe and anyone can be targeted anywhere around the world. Although it's exceptionally gruesome, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi is sadly not exceptional, but it was clearly within a long-standing pattern of repression peaceful dissent, which has only intensified since Mohammed bin Salman became crown prince. Since September 2017, there has been escalation and repression on freedoms of expression, association, and assembly in Saudi Arabia. And the unabated pattern of violation this past year reveals only one thing: the failure of silent diplomacy when faced with a sustained pattern of disregard of human rights, as we've seen in the case of Saudi. States such as the US, UK, and France, and others, which can use their leverage and influence over Saudi Arabia, have remained silent. In September 2017, the authorities launched a wave of arrests targeting religious clerics, journalists, activists, and human rights defenders. Last September, the international community chose to remain silent and looked instead towards the pledged reforms, including the reforms announced allowing women to drive. But now, many of those who were arbitrarily detained in the wave of arrests in September are now facing trial before the counter-terror court, and it includes religious clerics, activists, and others who are now facing the death penalty, as some of the panelists have described in their cases. So the stakes are high for these individuals. But the pattern of repression did not stop there. Earlier this year, in January and February, 4 human rights defenders were sentenced by the counter-terror court to prison terms that range between 4 and 14 years. And one of these individuals, whom several of the panelists have mentioned, is Mohammed al-Otaibi. And sadly, Mohammed al-Otaibi tried to flee Saudi Arabia to travel to seek asylum in Norway. However, he was detained in Qatar and deported back to Saudi before he was able to travel. The international community and European Union and European member states chose to remain silent at the time, and he was deported, and as he was deported and imprisoned back to Saudi Arabia. But by the time the EU did speak out in a brief statement, Mohammed al-Otaibi was already sentenced to 14 years. So after the EU, after Mohammed al-Otaibi was sentenced to 14 years, which he is now serving, the EU did speak out. But at the time, it was too late. Given this record, it's particularly disconcerting to see Saudi Arabia's allies once again reverting to silent diplomacy after the arrest of women human rights defenders, including Rujain al-Hadloul, Iman Nafjan, and Aziz al-Yusuf. These women are Saudi Arabia's most fearless activists and were the country's leading campaigners for the right to drive and the end of the male guardianship system. 2 other women, Nasima Sada and Samar Badawi, were later also detained, and they remain in detention. Dozens of other activists also remain in detention without charge. Once again, in May 2018 and in June, the international community remained silent on these cases. Beyond the statements that were made in the Human Rights Council by very few member states of the EU, leaders in France, the UK, the US, and other major arms selling states to Saudi Arabia remained silent on these cases. These women have stood up to protect women's rights, free speech, the rights of minorities. They have not been charged yet, and most concerning in their cases is the report of torture that Hala has described earlier. And once again, after the reports of torture were publicized, months after they allegedly happened, the international community continued to be silent. There is a lot at stake for these women human rights defenders and many other activists detained without charge, as well as activists and religious clerics now facing the death penalty. They and others, such as members of the Saudi Civil and Political Rights Association and other human rights defenders who are serving up to 15 years in prison, deserve our vocal support, and this is the least that leaders from key states can do to ensure that they are protected from torture and released immediately and unconditionally. This unprecedented level of persecution of human rights defenders is a disturbing sign that the crackdown is far from over. The EU and several of its member states, as well as other states in the international community, have spoken out firmly on the case of Jamal Khashoggi. But they should now also urge the Saudi Arabian authorities to end the crackdown on the human rights community, to release all prisoners of conscience, because the continued silence of the international community, and specifically of the key states that do have leverage on Saudi Arabia, gives a clear green light for the Saudi Arabian authorities to continue their dangerous repression on activists. And as many have described, a lot of activists now have at stake the death penalty. So it is now the time to speak out against these grave violations to prevent them from happening again. Thank you.
That wraps up our speakers for now. As I say, I hope many of them will stay online or will be available for any questions or clarifications. We're running a little bit behind time. I suggest about 10 minutes break, if that's okay. And then we'll come back. We'll start with any clarifications if you have any. Please stay with us if you can. And we want to sort of push forward. Dana ended with some recommendations about what to do next. What can we do? What is there to do? All of you have touched on it to some degree in different ways, and that's something which we hope to talk about in 10 minutes. So, until then. Okay. You're attached.
No, of course. I'll walk off with it.
Sorry?
I was just, thank you for reminding me, because otherwise I'd just get...
Tell her it's his name. Sorry,
I'm already on antibiotics. It's probably going to kill all the germs in there, so it's fine. Different angles and
What's the
make a good discussion.
new organization?
This one?
Your
oh, you mind? Yeah, let me get your card. It's very good you say. That's fantastic. Is there a reason why you say it? Good. Excellent. Do you have any questions? Do you speak French? I think you speak French to Julie. Julie speaks French. German.
أستاذ سامي شكرا جزيلا. كان باسم سبقا بأني لما يحيى الله أعطاني تليفوني
الله يسعدك والله.
الله يحفظك.
أنت إنسان طيب. إنسان طيب والله ييسر لك الناس الطيبين.
الله يخليك. الله يسعدك. أنا كان مشكلة غلط
except for maybe Sophie, who joined us by telephone, they are all online, which is great. They've stayed with us. I hope they can hear me. They're in touch with Sahar. If you have any questions or clarifications...
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you.
I have a small request before we're going in question, if you allow.
This sounds like Ali.
Yes, it is Ali.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like actually Mr. Yahya to speak at least. I know he is not in panelist, but at least if he can speak 3 or 5 minutes, this I think important to listen Mr. Yahya in this night.
Okay. I agree. Come on.
Yeah, okay. We'll all leave.
Come on.
I will go at the end, okay. Sure.
Sit down here. Come on.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, Yahya.
Thanks, Ali. You can object. Feel free to object. We support it. Great.
Yeah.
Do you all know Yahya? Yes? A few nods? Yeah, no, you don't at the back. So Yahya Asiri is the director of ALQST. That's the organization that's hosting this event tonight. The organization has been going for 4 or 5 years, branching out and making its mark on the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much indeed for you, Turi, and for the speakers here, for Ali Dubaisi, for speakers online, and thank you also for the audience and for the media. They are here. We are trying in this conference to gather the organizations, the NGOs all together to highlight the situation inside Saudi Arabia. Because right now we are working in ALQST as a bridge between the Saudi society, the Saudi people, and the NGOs. We are trying to provide information for the NGOs, and they are trying to support us by their capacities. And always, if I have complaint or something, contacting with Khalid in Gulf Center, contacting with Jolia, with Amnesty International, with Human Rights Watch, asking them to co-sign with us, to participate with us, to submit something with us. They have good capacity and they are really passionate to do the work. And we have the information usually from the ground as Ali Dubaisi and his organization. So I know in details what every NGO are doing from inside. So by gathering those people all together, that's to build a platform with all of them. And we are trying to build online platform to gather the information all together and to keep contact and coordinate all together. I don't prepare for the speech, and thank you very much for everyone. We have a report here, it's published here. I really encourage everyone to have a copy of the report. Thank you for the writer and researcher for the report. Thank you for people they work with, on it. And the NGOs participating with us, they review it and maybe they have some comments on it. Also the media, I encourage the media to have a copy of the report and to keep highlighting the situation, the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. شكرا جزيلا.
We'll open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any comments, questions, clarifications that you'd like to have? Any even from our participants online via Sahar?
Well, I have a comment quickly.
Please, Khalid.
شكرا أستاذ يحيى. بس أنت ما كل شيء. Really, I think it is time for us to leave this reactive approach to events that are out of our control and to take a proactive approach to eliminate difficulties in our human rights work in Saudi Arabia. There are some issues that we need to work on them, mentioned by respected panelists, my colleagues. To stop arming Saudi Arabia, to stop the export of software and hardware equipment to Saudi Arabia, to protect online activists. And also we need to really to build a strategy. We can't really go on facing all these chronic problems in a way that is not well organized. We need to have a strategy. We need, as people and NGOs who are working on Saudi Arabia, we need to get together a collective strategy. It is not for one organization to address problems and massive violations in Saudi Arabia. So from here I call for a coalition, for whatever you want to call it, as my colleague, respected colleague Yahya said, a platform. The name is not important, but let us work together. Let us have a strategy. This is very serious. We have people who are losing their lives in prisons. We have very respected colleagues who are in prison. Really, when I read their names, it's very hard for me because they are my colleagues. So I call from here for every single organization to be very serious about the issues that are going on in Saudi Arabia for so long. And we read, really, it's time. It's the proper time for us to take serious actions and to work together. That is all what I have, and I leave it for others to complete the talk.
I mean, I can't say I disagree. Does anyone from the floor wish to add anything, question anything? I mean, or Sahar, if there's anyone online who wishes to add anything to that or question. Julia.
Yes, I have some ideas on that.
Or Sahar, if there's anyone online who wishes to...
Amazing. It's a loop.
Julia.
So I have some ideas, maybe also how to move forward. I picked them also up by some of the comments made by the colleagues online and here in the room. How to take legal action, for example, abroad, how to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for its human rights violations, be that torture committed within Saudi Arabia or the violations in Yemen. I mean, there's always an option to file a complaint under the universal jurisdiction. If individuals that have been tortured know the names of the perpetrators of tortures or those in line of command that have ordered torture, and they're not currently holding political office, so they don't have immunity, they can actually be prosecuted for that in countries such as the UK or even in Switzerland. So this would be an option to go forward. Then also I really want to thank ALQST for organizing this conference, and they have been a great cooperational partner, and they have really called on all of us to work together, and by working together, obviously our voice is stronger, and I totally agree also with what Khaled has said. We need to join forces, we need to build a coalition, because together we are stronger. And also I think it was probably Yasmin who mentioned the media and how reports are not covered enough by the media. I mean, it's also, I think, up to us to try and exchange all the media contacts that we have, knowing who would be interested in reporting issues in different languages in different countries, to again like publicize each other's work as well. Like when I know that ALQST has done a report, I mean, I, in my capacity at the MENA Rights Group, will be very happy to also try and raise attention to the findings of this report and vice versa. Another point that I find can be quite helpful as well is lobbying with parliaments. In that case, we have experienced lobbying with the EU Parliament, and they're quite receptive to complaints on human rights when they occur, especially for human rights defenders. So I mean, I'm happy to share the contacts with the people I've worked with, the members of parliament or the head of the subcommittee on human rights, that are very interested in hearing about individual cases of violations and the flawed legislation that is underlying these practices. As a fourth point, I maybe go back to the UN complaints. Well, there is a confidential complaint procedure with the Human Rights Council. in which one can address systematic, widespread patterns of violations. So this is not 1 or 2 cases, this is 20, 100, 200 cases, something that proves that there is a systematic practice of human rights violations happening. It is a bit of a contested complaint procedure because it is confidential, so you can't really know what is going on. It is confidential so that there's a bigger likelihood that states will actually cooperate with this procedure. It's not about naming and shaming, it's rather about silent diplomacy, which does not always work, but if it doesn't work for a huge human rights violator as Saudi Arabia, then this complaint procedure is not good at all. And I know that there is a complaint procedure before the council right now, and I also urge to maybe discuss if there could be another procedure, another complaint that we can launch together, such as on the prosecution of human rights defenders under the anti-terrorism law or the cybercrime law. And as a fifth, and then there is obviously the UPR report, the UPR's review by Saudi Arabia, which I mentioned earlier, that happened in November. And the outcome of that review will be adopted next March during the Human Rights Council session. That means that in March, Saudi Arabia will let everyone know which of the recommendations it received it will accept and which it will reject. So this is a great opportunity for all of us to work together on lobbying efforts to make sure that Saudi Arabia accepts as many recommendations as possible and that everybody knows about which essential recommendations were not accepted. And as a fifth, if I may, very recently there was the Right Livelihoods Award or the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize that was given out to Mohammed Al-Qahtani, Abdallah Al-Hamid and Walid Abu Khair. Really great human rights defenders from within Saudi Arabia.
And this is the diploma for...
Just say again what it was. It's the Alternative Nobel
Peace Prize, and it's called the Rights Livelihood Award.
Yeah, he got it on behalf of the defenders.
Exactly. And this is also a great way to raise awareness of the very brave men and women in Saudi Arabia trying to fight for their fundamental rights. So there's not just this prize, but there's other prizes like the Martin Ennals Prize and the Václav Havel Prize and so on. So one can also submit recommendations for laureates to these awards as to raise more awareness on the human rights activists inside of Saudi Arabia.
Okay, Anne wanted to say something and Ali online wanted to say something.
I have questions online.
There are questions online as well, but I want to abuse my position just really briefly. Is there anything you can say about this other confidential procedure before the Human Rights Council? What can you say about it?
Well, I know about an ongoing complaint before the Human Rights Council. On the confidential 501 procedure. It works in two stages. There are a working group on communications and a working group on situation. First, the working group on communications proves if a complaint is admissible. There's a few criteria, and then you basically go back and forth with the working group on situations. They go back and forth with the state, where they're physically located, probably in Geneva or in New York.
I mean, like, how advanced is
this? It is quite
procedure?
Advanced, and it remains to be seen now in the next year or so what action they will take.
And process, it will take time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That is the only disadvantage.
Okay. Yes.
Okay. Before we go to the questions online, Anne, and then Ali, if you're watching, we'll come to you immediately after Anne.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anne first.
Okay, I think he was first, but anyway, what I was going to say is I totally agree about the need for media and parliamentary. I totally agree about the need for media and parliamentary attention. And one thing, it's not a criticism, but one thing that occurs to me here is that most of the speakers are not based in the UK, and if you want UK media and attention, it probably needs more of the UK-based organisations to get involved. And there are organisations like that we could certainly put you in touch with. There's an organisation, English Pen, for instance, that's been doing a lot of work on Raif Badawi, and there's others in their network on the journalist front. So that's one kind of area. But I do think I've got your card now, so maybe we meet up and discuss this in some detail. But I do think there would be UK media opportunities, because it strikes me that the Bahraini activists, I mean, I don't know if there are any Saudi activists here who don't mind going on the media, or whether you're all quite understandably. Well, the Bahraini activists, we get come out with Campaign Against Arms Trade and do a lot of joint kind of protests and things. It's got a huge amount of media, and I was just wondering if something similar could be done. I'm sure our media person would be very happy to help you. And certainly, you've given me your card, I'll follow it up.
Ali, if you would, there's a question in the room, but Ali, if you would, please.
Yeah, okay. Actually, thank you, Gregory. I found some time comparing to our report and some article written by some activists. There is a lot of influence. For example, I remember some article for Adam Kugel from Human Rights and his colleague Hiba. If I compare this article between their reports and Human Rights, I will find a lot of difference. We have good space to expression about and flexible space to expression about our views in the article. For that, I think all the activity here, maybe in our organization, we need to put time only for report. If we find an international media weekly one article by one of those activists here or another place, I think this will explain to the people in the world better than our normal report. Another point, actually very good what ALQST done in this conference. There is a lot of organization and activists, but I just want to mention the Committee for Human Rights. They are interesting about Saudi Arabia from organization and from activists. They are maybe double this, and we need together another people in the next event. Last point, I comment on Mr. Khalid, what he speak at the beginning of these questions. Maybe we need, before 2019 started, to do internal meeting between those organizations and between another organization. Maybe in this meeting, a closing meeting, we can planning some important advocacy, some important work, and we can do it in 2019. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. All good ideas, and I'm sure we'll come back to them. I don't know your name, but you had your arms up.
Oh yeah, my name's Prince, and I'm a journalist, and I haven't reported directly. It's okay. Well, I haven't reported directly on Saudi issues, but I was wondering if you can comment on the risk of naming and writing directly about activists who are inside Saudi Arabia. Does that magnify the risk for them in the current administration, and how do you propose people balance that and report on it safely?
I'd like to suggest Yahya address that if he can, if he paid attention.
The question from
because it seems like a balancing act to me.
It's not all information that could be published, because there's some information that will lead the government to our sources or that will affect the victim himself. But usually, if there is highlights in the cases, the government will be afraid from more violations. But if there is no highlight in the case, the government will feel free to keep violate the case more and more, because they will feel safe. There is nobody ask about this person, for example. So it's always brilliant or important to highlight the case, to talk about the violations. But in some cases, we need to worry about if this information will lead the government to know about our sources or to know about sometimes confidential information for the case. I would like to mention there's some media recently, they published a report and including false information, and they said this person behind the bars, he was he was writing or using this nickname in Twitter. The information was wrong. The person behind the bars have been tortured because the government is trying to make him convince this Twitter account is for him. And this torture came for victim from false information from some media. So it's needs some balance, but in general, it's much important to highlight the cases.
Could I just add one point very quickly? In general, like we don't publish anything without consent of families of the defenders. And on many occasions, human rights defenders and including women human rights defenders, they told us if we are going to be arrested, publish our cases. There are some other cases we can't publish because we don't have consent. So we are very sensitive about these issues. Thank you.
Now, Yahya's got some questions that have come in via Twitter or online.
There's a question, it's quite similar for her question, and it's also from media or from journalists. The question is for Hala Dosari. She mentioned torture against women, and the question is that by mentioning this and highlighting these cases, is that will affect the human rights defenders behind the bars, or that will help their cases? This is the first question for Hala. Can I say the other questions? Yeah. Second question. The second question, they say for the lady at the end, right? I think for Jolia. They said she's talked about the human rights mechanism. Is that will support the human rights situation, or human rights mechanism will do nothing? Always people asking about that. They believe the human rights NGOs and human rights mechanism have army and can stop the violations by force, and they don't understand the difficulty. So there is question for Jolia. They are saying basically in Arabic, what NGOs and the Human Rights Council do is completely nothing. You don't, they say, you didn't stop the war in Palestine, you didn't support Palestinians, so you will not support the Saudi people. The last question here is for Anne. They say, thank you for going to the court about the arms trade. Are you, how can I say it, because it's in Arabic, are you planning to go to the European court or any other courts around the world for the same case or no? This is what we have in mind.
Okay, so first to Hala. Yeah?
Hala.
If she's still online.
Was not sure. Hold on, please. Because I'm not sure the question is asking about whether there will be risks involved in speaking publicly about the torture of human rights defenders. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I think because of the nature of torture, I mean, before the state has used torture against human rights activists and against women repeatedly in different capacity, of course, in different forms. But because of the aggressive nature, I mean, we were worried that those women will be killed. We were worried that they will sustain like terminal injury, and we were worried because of the torture against so many people. And this is what we a glimpse of what we know. This is not the full profile of torture within the prisons of Saudi Arabia because of the inaccessibility of people to information. So we made a judgment call, basically, and we decided that these information are so critical and so dangerous to be kept in private. It should actually be a matter of public discussion. It should be exposed because of the risks involved if those kinds of practices are applied on other women or applied systematically on the same women. Like one of the women has committed suicide several times. I'm not sure how many others. This is what we only learned of. I'm not sure how many others have been attempting suicide or have sustained a traumatic, outcome because of those kinds of torture. It's very elevated, and I think aggressiveness of the details of the Jamal Khashoggi's torture and killing is chilling. It shouldn't be kept private. It should be like a matter of increased scrutiny against the practices of the regime. This is another level of terror and tyranny, and it should be exposed and it should be condemned. And of course, it's protective for the women. It should protect the women that these kinds of practices, because I don't think that it's protected anyway. I mean, we have remained silent for so many months just before the killing of Khashoggis. And a lot of other people before have remained silent about the arrest and detention and the use of authority practiced by the regime against the family members, but it didn't protect them. You know, you hear things. I heard things from Jamal before he was killed. I heard the atrocities conducted to ministers of state, to reputable community figures like Adel Faqih or Walid Fitehi or other people, really unwarranted, uncalled for. It was just like, it just tells you how much the regime was trying to project power and to terrorize influential figures. And it's really disturbing. And people did not talk about it. And we expected these kinds of accounts and we didn't talk about it. But then when it was, when we learned that it was very much all over the board, so many people are affected, and there is a very high probability or likelihood that you know, it is practiced on a wider scale than the scale on the scale of the activists only, because we know that there are more than 40 individuals involved in the women cases alone, and we're not sure who they are or what happened to them or how the state will go about their detention and charges and trial. So these are, I think, judgment calls, because we felt like, first, the women are not protected at all. They are completely under the mercy of the state. Second, you know, the practices and the atrocity of the nature of the torture that happen really require public outcry, public scrutiny. It's not something to be hidden or to be kept private because of the risks involved of such practices on the lives of women and on the country as a whole, on the state of detention as a whole, and the legal system and the other people who are detained as well.
The next question, I think, was to Julia about human rights mechanisms that don't do anything.
The UN system and the work that we as NGOs do, unfortunately, have not stopped the war in Yemen and have not stopped the abusive practices in Saudi Arabia just yet. But there's always something to be said, is that obviously the work that the UN does is relevant. Saudi Arabia has ratified international human rights treaties and has obligations under these treaties to respect human rights and can be held accountable. That doesn't mean that tomorrow there's a judgment and then there won't be any more weapons to Saudi, or certain practices of torture will forever be eliminated. But this is a legal tool to hold them accountable. It's not just a legal tool, it is also a basis on which one can lobby and which one can use the media. I mean, as Drury also mentioned, Saudi Arabia was reviewed by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or even the Committee on the Rights of the Child. They're very interesting and strong concluding observations that are a chance for Saudi Arabia to use to really improve their human rights record. And these are periodic reviews. There's a review in 1 year, and then 4 or 5 years later there's the next review. And there's more pressure being put on Saudi Arabia if the recommendations were not implemented. And that's a chance for us to raise these issues again. Very practically speaking, some of the mechanisms within the UN also are directly effective. Like, for example, if someone is enforcibly disappeared in Saudi Arabia, you engage with the UN Working Group on Enforced Disappearance. And if you don't do that, maybe that person will be disappeared for 6 months, 1 year. There's a higher likelihood that Saudi Arabia knows the UN is on their feet, on their back, that they will give an answer as to where a person is actually being held and allow them to have family contact and maybe access to a lawyer. Or for example, for the case of Salman al-Oda that we also submitted, we were not just only told where he was held, but the Saudi authorities replied to the UN confirming the official charges against Salman al-Oda before even his own son was informed about the charges. So there's definitely use in the UN human rights system, and yeah, I think that's.
And the violations will be more if there is no.
Of course, of course.
Well, I just add to add the fact that we have to continue our work. If we stop, they are going to kill everybody. That is our job. We have to work for human rights. We have to continue protecting people. And if you talk about the international mechanism, including the UN systems, there are a lot of success during the history of our work with the United Nations. In 2010, after the UPR of Egypt, a lot of prisoners of conscience were released due to the UPR. And also a lot of other communications behind the scene led to release of defenders. There is no time to talk about the individual cases. But the reality, this mechanism is there and we have to use it to the full.
And maybe there's also another ideological meaning or use of this. Even if us raising these complaints to the United Nations, or if us raising these complaints with the media doesn't bring change overnight, it brings support to the people that are affected.
Yeah.
They're not left alone with their struggle, but they feel that there's someone who cares and that will campaign on their behalf, and that their concerns are being heard. And that's not just the people in prison, it's also their families.
And the situation is not basic as you don't free these prisoners, and it's not black and white like that.
True.
There was a question for...
yeah. And then a question from Flor.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think it's very, very important. You have to keep trying, and I think we are gradually succeeding. For instance, on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, only about 7% of the UK population now support them. I mean, it's massively against the population as a whole, and the whole issue's been raised so much more. I was asked about courts outside the UK. Well, we're actually bringing our case. It's in the administrative court, and it's basically the argument is that the minister authorising the arms exports didn't follow the correct procedure. So it's under the arms export licensing rules. Every country has its own kind of, well, there's a European code of conduct, but each country interprets it differently. And some of them, you can only a victim can bring challenges and things. I know that's the case in Germany because they've tried. But there are under completely different sort of legal system. In Italy, there's also a case being brought against arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's, as I say, it's a very different kind of legal setup there. In France, somebody is trying. And I know in Canada, there's a university professor has taken legal action, and he's already lost in the High Court and their Court of Appeal, but he's now taking it another step. And in all these cases, it's not being done in isolation. It's also happening with lobbying and all the other kind of things. And all these legal cases, people are in touch with each other about them. There's an organisation in Berlin that has been trying to explore the possibilities for legal action in different countries.
Okay, we are running out of time. We have one other question in the room. Yeah, don't turn around, it was you.
Yeah, it's my question.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for, it's my first time to be here tonight, and I'm so happy with that, and it's really great to be here, and thank you very much for the speaker.
Your name, your organization? Okay.
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Just my question is there any kind of pressure from the organization Human Rights and Amnesty for the Congress to take that's an action regarding that's really, because it is really important for the human rights and this organization to put pressure on the Congress to take
U.S. Congress.
Yes.
Of course. Yeah. To take a serious action regarding that's what's going on that's related that's the Saudi crown prince, because that's we are talking here. You're talking about the human right, and that's they're trying to send that's letters or send kind of reports to him regarding that's the cases that all of us we've been talking about them, but that's who are we are talking about? That he is a criminal because he is the one who is that's involved in this incidents as we talk. So who is the one that we need to talk to? So this is the question, if it is clear to you.
Okay, very clear.
Would you allow me just 2 questions online? Quick question.
Yeah.
I allow you. I'm not sure the real boss allows you.
It's an important question. It's very important.
Yasmin and Ali left.
What about Dana from Amnesty?
Dana has left already.
So it's 2 hours later in Beirut.
Okay. So let us say here the questions. We have a question about the Congress, and then?
Yes. How about addressing the question about Congress?
Okay.
For us.
Well,
question online?
Well, I think it's an important question. It's about the unconditional support that...
Before we come to that.
Okay.
Well, look, I've got an idea about it. I mean, I agree with you. And given that there has been some movement from some senators who apparently were close to Jamal Khashoggi anyway, that it would seem like pushing at an open door for Amnesty, our friends at Amnesty and Human Rights Watch in particular. Of course, they're got quite a big office in New York, and maybe that's something that we will return to. I think a few of us have already talked about speaking.
Currently, with the new Congress that takes over in January, it's even more likely that they will take action.
Yeah, but we are talking about, we're still talking about, that there is some people, they may gonna be prosecuted, that soon. So if there is, that's not serious action it takes, that it's gonna be serious, that's crime, it's gonna be there as well. So we have to consider this, because if we have just only to wait for the Congress, the new Congress it becomes, and that's, sorry about that, the President Trump, he is playing around with everybody, he's playing with lots of people's lives and our lives as well, because we are suffering as well. We can't even communicate with each other, because just we are waiting for just an answer for that's the people who may gonna be killed soon. And that's we have that's the Crown Prince, he is doing what he's doing, and nobody doing nothing for taking a serious action for this.
Well, briefly, I just want to tell you, the unconditional support by UK and US in particular to the ruling family in Saudi Arabia. This unconditional support is the main reason maybe behind all these massive violations. This is long ongoing in history of the relationship between the two countries and Saudi Arabia. Now you have to work on it on a long-term plan of actions. It is not about something that will happen immediately. There are a lot of profits, a lot of ties, a lot of personal relationships. So this needs a strategy, a collective work. It's not, as I said, a work of one organization. It will take time. It's not going to happen immediately that people will punish Saudi Arabia, but it is up to us and to other countries that are supporting human rights in Saudi Arabia to take action and to put the pressure on UK and US to change their double standard. They are talking about human rights in South Korea, or I don't know where, in Northern Korea, and they are ignoring what is going on in Saudi Arabia. It's not an easy job. It will take time. Sorry for that. But that's the reality.
The question online, it's asking Amnesty International and FIDH, Federal International for Human Rights. They ask them, you always talking about Saudi Arabia. You never talked about Israel or Iran. You just talk about Saudi Arabia. You are not real human rights organizations.
Yes, I mean.
ياسمين معنا؟ ياسمين تسمع؟ ياسمين؟
Yes, hello. Well, that's not true, actually. That's not true at all. This morning, actually, I went to the Justice Ministry here in Paris. Human Rights has awarded a special prize to an Israeli defender jointly with the Palestinian human rights defender. And basically we have been facing many attacks by the Israeli government for this. I mean, it's just one example. So no, we do talk about Israel a lot. And then Iran is not exactly in my zone, but we are also vocal. Our former president is Iranian, actually. So, so we do talk about all the countries without distinctions when it comes to human rights violations. Any other question?
This is a question, and by the way, publish anything against Iran. They publish it in the Saudi media. But when you publish something about Saudi Arabia, they criticize you.
Curious.
Yeah, but as you know, for FIDH, it's always very complicated to work when we don't have member organizations in the country. And in Iran, we do have member organizations, but they are quite divided, as far as I know. And they work in very difficult circumstances. They have huge difficulties to document violations, and since they are divided, it's quite a handicap as well for us. But you're right. We may think. I think it would be good if we could come up with a stronger strategy that would include Iran and Saudi Arabia in the same boat. Yeah.
Well, in general, if you open your eyes for violation in a country and close it for violation in another country, it's better for you not to be a human rights defender. Go and sell apples in the market.
This question.
The reality, if you are a defender, you work on all the violations without any discrimination in all countries. That is the purely human rights work.
This question is always from the pro-government, Saudi pro-government.
Okay.
They are always talking about NGOs. They always saying the NGOs only talking about Saudi Arabia, and this is completely not true.
Depending what's on our webpage, we get told we're anti-Israeli or anti-Saudi, and why aren't you working on the other one?
So
we work on both.
That's clear, you know.
Any final contributions? So
give 1 minute to each speaker, so we will finalize our thoughts. From Julia.
Would you like to have 1 minute to finalize?
Yes, why? Yes, Julia is ready. I know Julia is ready.
She's always ready to speak.
I do have
you have got a mic anyway.
Thank you very much. Well, to sum up, I think thank you all for, I mean, it's not me to thank you to attend, but thank you for cooperating. And I look forward to having more of this. And I'm also happy to take a bit on the lead of what I can do from the UN side in Geneva, try to coordinate action, public action, legal action. There is definitely a long list of things that we can do, and we just need to arm ourselves with a bit of patience. This is a struggle that will remain for the next months and years to come. But as long as we work together, we will achieve change. And I'll leave it there.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope I've made some good contacts today. I'm very, very sorry we can't move fast enough. It just grieves me, so we'll do our best.
Yeah. Well, I would like to thank my colleague Yahya and his team, and also my colleague Jory for all their hard work. It is a successful meeting. We met, we talked about some important issues in such a very difficult time. Arming Saudi Arabia should be stopped, exporting equipment to monitor online activism should be stopped. We have the issue of impunity and accountability in Saudi Arabia. We have the detained defenders, including the women defenders. all these issues really calling upon us to create a working strategy to come together. I think we could organize a meeting face-to-face to maybe this month, if possible, in one of these cities, to really have a plan of actions for 2019. I'm very optimistic. Next March, together with ALQST, we will have some activities during the 40th session of the Human Rights Council. We are really taking the issues related to human rights in Saudi Arabia very seriously. We are working with reliable partners such as ALQST and others. So I think the change is coming. Maybe, again, it will take time, but the change is coming.
People around the world, some of them, they stand for their interests, and some stand for their values. All of you here, you stand for your values. So thank you very much indeed for you as speakers, NGOs, and people behind the screens for standing for human rights. Thank you very much indeed for your efforts, not just for attending today and for speaking today, but for all your brilliant efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.